Welcome to another wonderful PureRead audiobook. It's wonderful to have you with us. Before we get started, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple and easy way ensures we can continue adding more delightful audiobooks for your listening enjoyment. The following story is copyrighted PureRead Limited, the home of books you can trust. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy. The Story of Ruth, an Amish romance by Grace Given. Chapter 1, A Dark Night. Don't forget your heavy coat. Ruth Miller handed the coat to her husband, John. And don't forget your glasses. Her mother-in-law, Naomi Miller, dried her hands on a towel at the sink and laughed over her shoulder. You sound like he's going away to sea. He's only going overnight. Ruth's sister-in-law, Orpah, came into the room, hand in hand with her husband, Mark. They exchanged a few murmured words in the doorway before Mark joined John. If we finish early at the auctions, we'll come home early. John took Ruth's hand. Either way, we'll be home in time for supper tomorrow. No ifs, ands, or buts. Orpah carried Mark's bag to the door. You talked to the man with those plow horses for sale, and he said he would keep them aside for you. You shouldn't have any trouble getting them. We can't count on that, John told her. Someone else could have his eye on those horses. I haven't seen a finer pair come up for sale in years, and any man with sense would bid a lot more than we can afford to pay. We could come home empty-handed. Ruth shut her eyes and shook her head. Don't think that way. You've been after these horses for 6 months. You can't come home empty-handed. You can't. He let go of her hand. Don't you worry. I'm going to do everything I can to get them, but we have to trust in Gott. Man makes his plans, and Gott laughs. He has his own plan for us, and we can only submit to it. Mark opened the door, and he and Orpah went out onto the front porch. Naomi put down her laundry basket and joined them. Mark took his bag out of Orpah's hands and slung it up behind the buggy, waiting at the door. Come on. The day isn't getting any longer. John turned one last time to Ruth and squeezed her hands. Keep the home fires burning. We'll be back before you know it. Ruth smiled up at him. God go with you both. He tarried over her, and his eyes searched her upturned face. Ruth gazed back into his eyes with a knowing smile. His eyes darted down to her mouth, and back up to her mouth, and back up to her eyes. Naomi turned away, and Orpah waved to Mark in the buggy. He called to his brother through the window. Are you coming? John didn't show any sign of hearing him. He stared into Ruth's eyes, and her heart pattered in her chest. You better go. He nodded, but he didn't turn away. Mark called again. Hey! Ruth laughed and stole a glance toward the buggy. In the end, John smiled, kissed her squarely on the lips, and turned away. Ruth Miller, I love you, he said. I love you too, John. Now go before Mark climbs down and drags you onto the buggy. She laughed, waving as he scurried down the pathway. John was a good man, and Ruth felt blessed that God had brought them together. He climbed into the buggy, and soon the men were on their way, laughing together as they began their journey. Drive safely, Orpah called to them. Mark waved through the window, and the two women waved back. He clucked to the horse, and the buggy rolled out of the yard into the road. Orpah headed for the door, but Ruth stood where she was and watched the buggy out of sight. Even after it disappeared around the bend, she kept her eyes fixed on the spot where she last saw it. Naomi's voice reached her ear from inside. Come and help me with the laundry, you girls. I'm not as strong as I used to be. Orpah laughed. but she took hold of the wringer handle and started cranking. "You're just as strong as you always were. You could work us both into the ground." Naomi scrubbed a pair of pants against her washboard. "I won't be able to work like this forever. Then I won't be much good to you." Ruth took the iron kettle off the stove and poured boiling water into the tub for the next load of laundry. "You don't have to work like this all the time, Mommy. You could sit down for a while and work on your knitting. You don't have to break your back from sun up to sundown every day of the week." Naomi shook her head. "I've got a job to do, and I'm going to do it. The laundry won't do itself, and you girls have enough to do with keeping this farm running, especially when the boys have to go away on business." "You do as much as the rest of us," Ruth returned. "You always have." Naomi dried her hands again and picked up a basket of finished laundry, but Ruth took it out of her hands. "I mean it, Mommy," she told her. "I'll hang this up, and Orpah and I will finish the laundry. You sit down and have a cup of coffee." "You've done enough." Naomi tried to protest, but Ruth wouldn't hear it. She pushed her mother-in-law into a chair by the stove and put the coffee pot on to boil. "I'll be right back." That night, the three women sat around the kitchen table after supper with a lamp burning between them. Orpah bent over her sewing, and Naomi and Ruth knitted. Their needles clicked in the stillness. "What do you think the boys are doing right now?" Orpah asked. Naomi chuckled. "They're probably snoring their heads off. I don't know how you two girls sleep with that noise. I can hear it all the way in my room at the other end of the house." Ruth cocked her head to one side. "Does John snore?" "I never hear a thing." "You sleep so soundly you probably snore just as loudly," Orpah replied. "Ruth doesn't snore," Naomi told her. "I would hear if she did, but I definitely hear the two boys." "What about you, Orpah? Do you hear Mark snoring?" "How could I not hear?" Orpah shot back. "I'm lying right there next to him, and he snores loud enough to keep me awake." "Why don't you do something to stop him?" Naomi asked. "Like what?" "I don't know," Naomi replied. "Jab him with a stick or something." Ruth gasped. "Mommy!" "What's wrong with that?" Naomi asked. "That's what I used to do to my husband Eli when he used to wake me up at night. I used to keep a special stick in the corner next to the bed, and when he'd start sawing logs, I would give him a whack with it." Ruth shook her head. "You shouldn't talk like that, Mommy. It can't be decent." "Well, I wouldn't really whack him," Naomi replied. "It was really just a loving tap, and I would say, 'Eli, stop snoring,' and he would snort and turn over and stop snoring. I don't think he ever even woke up." Orpah chuckled, and Ruth went back to what she was doing. The crackle of the fire and the click of knitting needles filled the room. Ruth smiled to herself in contented satisfaction. Only John's absence marred the perfect harmony of the scene. All at once, the rattle of chains tinkled up to the house from outside. Ruth's head shot up. "That's the gate." Orpah set her sewing aside. "The boys couldn't be back so soon. The auction isn't until tomorrow morning." Ruth jumped up and put her hand out for the doorknob. "They must have talked to the owner before the auction and got the horses on the side. They'll be over the moon." But she stopped in mid-stride when a knock touched the door. Naomi gasped. She set her own knitting on the table, and all three women stood around the door, but none of them dared to open it. The knock came a second time. Ruth and Naomi glanced at each other. "What are we going to do?" Ruth took a deep breath and stepped forward. We better answer it. That's the only way we'll find out what's going on." She turned the knob, and the door swung open. The lamplight flooded through the opening and shone on the faces of 2 uniformed policemen standing on the porch. They scanned the 3 women's faces. "Mrs. Miller?" All 3 women answered at once. "Yes." One of the police officers moved into the light. "I'm sorry to disturb you like this so late at night, but I have terrible news." Chapter 2. Where you go, I will go. Whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Ruth 1:16. 3 weeks later. Naomi Miller gazed out the window at nothing. Her wrinkled old hands tore at the lettuce in the sink without looking at what she was doing. He was such a fine man in his day. The 2 young women at the table behind her exchanged glances. Orpah Miller bent over her sewing again, but her sister-in-law Ruth set aside her knitting and went to the old woman at the sink. She put her hands on Naomi's shoulders and turned her away from the window. "Come sit down." She guided Naomi to the table and sat her in a chair next to Orpah. She laid a towel in Naomi's hands and went to the sink herself. Naomi gazed down at the towel in her lap. "I was right. I'm not much good to you girls anymore." Orpah didn't look up from her sewing, but Ruth called back over her shoulder, "What are you talking about? Of course you are. That's a fine thing to say. We need you now more than ever." Naomi shook her head. "We've had a good life here in Ohio, but ever since the boys died, things haven't been the same." Ruth finished tearing the lettuce and set to work to cut the tomato for their salad. "What makes you think that? What makes you think we can't keep having a good life here?" Naomi stared straight in front of her. Her eyes didn't see the world around her anymore. The past months had been hard on the whole family, but Naomi was hit the hardest. Her mind stretched back, replaying some distant memory as it flickered on the curtain of her imagination. "I met my husband Eli on a trip out here to visit my aunt," Naomi told them. "My parents kept in touch with her even though she was Mennished. I was on Rumspringa then, and my parents thought I should get out and see some of the country while I had the chance." Orpah caught Ruth's eye over Naomi's shoulder and rolled her eyes. They'd heard the story so many times, especially in the last few weeks, since Naomi's sons, Mark and John, Ruth and Orpah's husbands, were killed. Since they got the news of the tragic accident, Naomi slipped farther and farther away into her own internal world. Ruth busied herself with the salad. Orpah never had much use for Naomi's life stories. She was at heart a pragmatist, not given in the least to sentimentalities. She preferred the lively company of other young people like her husband and brother, and sister-in-law. Since Mark and John died, Orpah stuck to Ruth's side more than ever. She took every opportunity to disrespect Naomi behind her back. She didn't dare do it to her face, but she even made rude faces at her when her back was turned. Nothing could anger Ruth more. Next to her husband, she loved Naomi more than anyone in the world. She loved nothing better than to hear the tales of her youth and courtship. If only she could live such a long and fruitful life. Naomi sighed and clasped her hands in her lap. "You know what it's like when you're courting. You don't want to be anywhere but with the man of your heart. After we married, I moved with Eli to be closer to his family. My family was old order, and his family was new order, but I made the adjustment. And here you are," Ruth concluded. "Here I am," Naomi agreed. "You wouldn't think I would stay here so long, but I did." "You've been happy here, though, haven't you?" Ruth asked. "You don't regret your decision?" "Oh, no," Naomi replied. I never regretted it, not even after Eli died. The community was so caring and helpful. They rallied around me when I was left a widow with 2 sons, and the boys helped out a lot. They weren't boys then, Orpah chimed in. They were grown men and courting us at the time. That's true, Naomi admitted. You tend to forget those things. I always remember them as boys. Even during the last 7 years, when the 4 of you lived here with me and ran this farm, I always considered them boys, and you 2 girls. Isn't that silly? Orpah said yes, and Ruth said no, at the same time. They stared at each other. Then Ruth laughed. Never mind. Let's clear the table and eat. Orpah stuck her needle into her sewing and put the fabric aside. She took the plates out of Ruth's hands and set the table. Naomi didn't move. She stared in front of her at her invisible panorama of images. I was so happy when boys married you girls, Naomi went on. You don't know what it's like, living with a husband and 2 sons. You forget sometimes that you're a woman, and you have feelings and needs men don't have. They just don't understand. But when you 2 came to live here with me, I felt you were the daughters I never had. Ruth brought the silverware to the table and laid it out. She stopped what she was doing to lay her hand on Naomi's shoulder. I felt the same way about you. I felt you were going to be my new mother. Naomi raised her milky eyes to Ruth's face. Tears brimmed up in them. I don't know what I would have done without you. Orpah went outside. The kitchen door slammed behind her. Ruth looked after her but didn't bother to wonder where Orpah was going. She never could stand to hear Ruth and Naomi talk about how happy they were with each other. That sort of conversation rubbed Orpah the wrong way. Naomi choked back sobs. Now what are we going to do? Ruth put her handful of silverware on the table and knelt down in front of Naomi. She wrapped her arms around Naomi's hips and gazed up into her eyes. Don't worry, Mommy. Everything will be all right. The community rallied around you once before. They'll do it again. With Orpah gone, Naomi gave vent to her feelings. I was young then. I could work. I got a position helping out on a nearby farm, and the boys took over the farm like they'd done it all their lives. I'm old now, and we don't have a man between the 3 of us. We'll make it, Mommy, Ruth replied. I can get a job, and Orpah. She trailed off. Well, I don't know what Orpah will do, but we'll be all right, one way or the other. Naomi shook her head. I was so happy when John married you. The elders didn't approve of John marrying a Mennonite girl. I don't mean to hurt your feelings, dear, but I was happy about it. It doesn't hurt my feelings, Ruth replied. I know a lot of people didn't approve of me when John first married me, but they got used to having a Mennonite girl around. I think I've proven myself in the 7 years since I came to live here. You've done more than that, Naomi replied. This community loves you as much as I do. Everyone loves you. Ruth, you're so hard, working and good-hearted. A woman couldn't ask for a better daughter. In-law than you? Orpah came back with the day's eggs in her apron. She glanced at Ruth on the floor in front of Naomi and went to put the eggs in the basket on the counter. Ruth blushed and stood up. Don't worry, Mommy. You'll drive yourself into an early grave with your worrying. God has always taken care of us before, and He'll do it now. Orpah sat down at the table and stared at Ruth. Ruth put the salad on the table and brought the bread basket from the counter. The 2 young women bent their heads over the food, and Naomi said the blessing. When she finished, the 3 women ate in silence. Ruth gazed across the table at Naomi. God wouldn't take Mark and John away the way he did if he didn't have some plan for us, she remarked. He wouldn't leave us destitute. We just have to trust in him to take care of us. Naomi stared down into her plate. Her usual stalwart faith, a faith that had outlived innumerable trials, was deeply challenged by this final blow. Trusting him won't pay the mortgage. I know what you said before about getting a job, but you could never make enough for us to live here. The best thing to do would be to sell the farm. Ruth gasped. Sell the farm! You couldn't. This farm was in Eli's family for 4 generations before he died. You couldn't sell it. Besides, where would we go? What would we do? We couldn't survive without the farm. Naomi raised her eyes to Ruth's clear face, and her expression made Ruth shudder. We aren't going to do anything. I'm going back to my people in Iowa. What? Ruth cried. You can't. I can, Naomi declared. I've been living New Order for almost 30 years, and I want to go back to my old order people before I die. Ruth cast a quick glance at Orpah. But what about us? What's going to happen to us after you leave? You girls should go back to your own people, too, Naomi told her. You came from Amish people, Orpah, but Ruth came from Mennonite people. You should both go back to your families. With the grace of God, you'll find husbands. You're both still young. You can have families and rebuild your lives. Ruth cried out in dismay. She covered her mouth with her hand, but Orpah only nodded at her elderly mother-in-law. That's what I was planning to do. I was just waiting for the right time and place to tell you. I'm glad you brought it up. Naomi's chin sank down on her chest. Tears sprang into Ruth's eyes at the sight of her. Naomi suggested this plan herself, but she couldn't hide how much it hurt when Orpah took her up on it. She couldn't expect 2 young women, with their whole lives in front of them, to sacrifice themselves for her. Still, she didn't want to be left alone. Without Ruth and Orpah, the last shred of her life would crumble. Those rotten English, Naomi sobbed. How could they do this to us? Don't they have any decency at all? Ruth put her hand on Naomi's arm. The man who ran down Mark and John's buggy with his truck was drunk out of his mind. The police officer said he was 7 times over the legal alcohol limit. That tells you how far away from God he was. All we can do is forgive and let God bring the heart of that man back to himself. We know that John and Mark are safe with our Lord. But this man, we must pray for him, Mommy. Orpah faced her sister-in-law. You should go back to your people too, Ruth. A lot of men will be glad to court you. We can have a good life somewhere else with new husbands. We can have children and be successful. Ruth cast one last look at Naomi's hanging head before she made up her mind. No. If you're going back to Iowa, Mommy, I'm coming with you. Naomi's head shot up. You can't do that. You're too young to be saddled with an old woman like me. You should build yourself a new life. Ruth threw back her shoulders. The life I have here is with you, and if I'm going to build a new life somewhere, it will be with you. I have no more reason to go back to my people than to go anywhere else. Naomi stared at her. Are you sure you want to do that? You know what old order Amish communities are like? Ruth shrugged. I left my home and my family and my community to marry John, and I've lived Amish for 7 years. I can adapt. Naomi wiped her face on her apron. Already the light of hope shone in her eyes where her son's deaths had almost snuffed it out. You don't have to do this, you know. I'll be all right on my own. You can still change your mind. Ruth stood up. I won't change my mind. Where you go, I will go, and where you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your Gott will be my Gott. Whatever happens, I won't be separated from you for the rest of my life. Chapter 3. Coming Home. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her. Ruth 1:22. Ruth stepped down from the buggy and looked around. Then she gave Naomi a hand down into the road. Pulling the suitcase and 2 cloth bags off the back of the buggy, she set them down next to her mother-in-law. She stuck her face up next to the buggy window. "Thank you very much for the ride," she called. "God bless you." "God bless you, young woman," the driver called back. "It was my pleasure." The driver slapped the reins on the horse's back, and the buggy rolled away, out of Ruth's life forever. Ruth and Naomi gazed up at the farmhouse in silence. The golden glow of sunset lit up the roofs and glistened on the whitewashed walls of the barns and sheds. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Ruth asked. Naomi looked around. "We've come all this way. They're my closest relations. I have to try." "What if it doesn't work?" Ruth asked. "It has to work," Naomi murmured. "They're Amish. They won't turn us away." "You're their kinswoman," Ruth pointed out. "I'm not." Naomi turned to her with a fierce determination in her eyes. "You're my daughter-in-law. They have to take me in, and they have to take you in, and they have to take you in, too. You know how Amish people are. They won't turn us away in our hour of need." Ruth didn't answer. Naomi hesitated another moment. Then she took a deep breath and started walking up the long driveway to the house. She knocked on the screen door. A blue heeler dog lay on the porch and panted up at them through his wide mouth, but he didn't budge. Naomi waited a long time, but no one answered. Then she knocked again. "Maybe there's no one home," Ruth murmured. "They have to be," Naomi insisted. "They just have to be." "Maybe they're still out in the fields," Ruth suggested. "It's barley time." "They could be working late." At that moment, the distant tinkle of a supper bell rang across the fields. "No," Naomi replied. "It's too late. They will have finished work a long time ago. They'll all be home for supper. They should be here." She knocked again. After another long wait and still no answer, Naomi turned away from the door with a heavy sigh. "What do you want to do now?" Ruth asked. Naomi looked around. "We'll have to find somewhere to spend the night." "Where?" Ruth asked. Just then, a door slammed in the big barn, and a man strode toward them carrying a full bucket at his side. He stared down at the ground in front of him in concentration, not to spill the bucket. He didn't see the 2 women on the porch until he got halfway across the yard. He set the bucket down at the bottom of the steps. Ruth saw the thick, creamy milk inside. "Guter Ode." "Guter Ode," Naomi replied. "I'm looking for Jacob and Boaz Beiler." "You found them?" he told her. "I'm Jacob Beiler. Can I help you?" Naomi started to smile, but she bit it back. "I'm Naomi Miller. I'm the sister of your father, Moses Beiler. I was born and raised in this house until I moved away to Ohio to marry Eli Miller. Your vater must have told you about me. I'm your aunt." Jacob glanced at Ruth, then back to Naomi. "Moses Beiler was my grootstaddy, my grandfather, not my vater. If you really are his sister, you would be my great-aunt, not my aunt." Naomi flushed and looked down at the ground. "My mistake. I've been away longer than I realized." Did you want to have a look around the old home place? Jacob asked. Is that why you've come out from Ohio? Naomi kicked at the floorboards with her toe. Not exactly. You're welcome to come in for a meal, Jacob replied. I'll just tell my wife Mary to set 2 more places. We were just about to sit down ourselves. He picked up the bucket and started for the door. Naomi raised her hand to stop him. Wait, Jacob. We didn't come to see the home place, and we didn't come to share a meal, at least not for tonight. You see, I've come back to Iowa to live with my old community. I've been away too long, and now I've come home. You and Boaz are my nearest living relatives. He cocked his head to one side. Oh. Naomi's words rushed out of her mouth. My husband Eli died 7 years ago, but my 2 sons, Mark and John, took wives, and we lived on a farm with the New Order. 3 months ago, Mark and John were killed by a drunk driver who ran their buggy off the road. Jacob bowed his head. May God grant them peace. Thank you. Naomi took a deep breath. So you see, Jacob, I've come back to my old home to live. This is my daughter-in-law, Ruth Miller. She decided to come back with me. We have nowhere else to live. We're hoping we could rely on your goodwill in our time of need. He stiffened. I see. Naomi stole a glance at his face. Then she lowered her gaze to the ground again. I know it's a lot to ask. We could look for somewhere else to stay while you decide what to do. He glared at her for an instant. Then his shoulders sagged, and he shrugged. That's all right. Come inside and get something to eat. We'll find a place for you. Naomi started babbling. You don't have to go out of your way for us. We both know how to work hard and will earn our own way. We won't be a burden to you. Jacob looked over his shoulder at her and raised his eyebrows. That's all right. You're family. We'll find a place for you. It just took me a minute to realize what you were saying. Naomi shut her mouth with a click. She exchanged glances with Ruth. Jacob took his milk bucket inside and left the 2 women standing on the porch. Voices rose and fell inside the house, but they couldn't make out any words. After a minute, he stuck his head out again. Are you coming in? Ruth and Naomi hurried inside and found an Amish woman setting the table. Her plain brown dress and dark blue apron immediately put them at ease. They knew how to communicate with a woman like this. They knew what to expect and what was expected of them in return. She smiled when they entered. Guter Ode. They returned her greeting. Guter Ode. This is my wife Mary. Jacob waved his hand toward the table. Won't you join us? You must be hungry after your journey. Ruth and Naomi sat down, and when Mary joined them, they all lowered their heads while Jacob said a blessing. We can't thank you enough for your hospitality, Naomi said. Don't thank us, Mary replied. You're more than welcome. I know you must be surprised that we just showed up on your doorstep like this, Naomi went on. But I want you to know we won't be a burden to you. Mary held up her hand. You don't have to explain anything. This is your home. You always have a place here. We just have to figure out where to put you. Jacob glanced at his wife. That's easy, Mary replied. They can stay in the old farm worker's cottage. It isn't much, but it's comfortable and clean. Or at least it will be clean when it's scrubbed up a bit. That's a good idea, Jacob agreed. No one has lived in it for a long time. It could use a bit of elbow grease. But if you don't mind simple, it could be perfect for you. Naomi's face lit up. We would never ask for anything more. We like simple. I hope you understand I won't be around much right at the moment, Jacob added. We're in the middle of the barley harvest, so I'm putting in long hours out in the fields. But if you need anything, you just let me know. You should help yourself to the garden, and you can take as much milk as you need from the cows in the barn. You can reap the edges of the barley fields for grain. Naomi dabbed the corners of her eyes with her apron. Thank you, Jacob. You're a blessing. He shifted in his chair. When you finish eating, I'll show you the cottage. Mary cleared the table, and Naomi and Ruth followed Jacob outside. The golden rays of sunset shone through the trees, and the smell of fresh-cut barley perfumed the air. Naomi took a deep breath. It's good to be home. I never smelled anything that good before or since. Jacob peered at her from under his hat. Didn't the fields smell that way in Ohio? Naomi smiled. I really can't remember, but nothing smells quite like home. It brings back memories. Jacob stepped off the porch, and the women followed him. He pointed to the buildings. That's the dairy barn. You go in there and find yourself a cow if you need any milk. There's the garden over there, and that's the hen house if you need eggs. This is a sizable farm, Jacob, Naomi remarked. You've done well for yourself. Jacob shrugged. By the grace of Gott. My brother Boaz runs a pretty good business, too. Naomi looked around. Where is Boaz? I haven't seen him? He's away on business at the moment, he replied. He travels a lot, but when he's here, he pitches in, the same as the rest of us. You'll see him in a few days. What sort of business does he do? Naomi asked. He distributes non-electric farm goods to the Amish communities in the tri-state area, Jacob explained. He travels a lot since he doesn't have any other way to communicate with his customers other than to show up at their farms. He always comes back to help out when I need him, though. Even though he's not here much, I wouldn't be able to run the place without him. He's the best farming partner any man could ask for. Naomi nodded, and Jacob started forward again. They hadn't gone more than a dozen paces, though, when the women stopped. That's not the cottage, is it? That? Jacob laughed. I'm afraid not. That's Boaz's house. It's a mansion, isn't it? No single man would need a house that big. But it was here when we bought the farm, and I was already married to Mary then, so he took this one. That's the cottage over there. Ruth and Naomi both let out a breath of relief when they laid eyes on their new home. It was very small and very humble, just right for them. Naomi smiled at Jacob. Thank you. I know you told me not to thank you anymore, but thank you. I can't express my gratitude enough. Then don't. Make yourselves comfortable. I'll see you in the morning to find out if you need anything. He walked back to the house. Naomi gazed after him. He's a good plain man. Ruth nodded. This is more than I ever dreamed of. They went into the cottage and had a good look around. A thick layer of dust covered everything, but Naomi found a wooden rocking chair in front of the cold iron stove and sat down in it. Ruth laughed at her. You look like you never plan to move again. Naomi smiled up at her. I don't think I will. You take the bed. I'll sleep here tonight. Ruth laughed again, but she stopped when she put her head into the bedroom. There's only one bed, so you'll have to take it. You'll get sore if you sleep in that rocker. But first, the bedding needs a good shake-out. She busied herself making up the bed, and when she went back into the front room, she found Naomi asleep in the rocker, just like she said. Ruth gazed at the old woman for a long time. Poor old Naomi. She said all the right words, but she was getting too old to help out around the farm. She couldn't do anything to earn their keep. Ruth would have to do that herself, Naomi had no one else in the world to look after her in her old age. No matter how kind and generous Jacob and Mary were, they wouldn't take care of Naomi. They probably didn't even realize she needed taking care of. In all the world, Naomi had no one but Ruth to rely on. Ruth squared her shoulders. She hadn't understood the situation when she decided to return to Iowa with Naomi. She only sensed something calling her to do so. She couldn't do anything else, but she understood now. Naomi needed her. Not even Orpah realized just how much Mark and John's deaths had shattered Naomi. She'd worked alongside her daughters-in-law. Right up to the very moment when that police officer broke the news to her that her sons were dead, that's when she collapsed. She would never work again. Ruth went over to the rocking chair, but she didn't have the heart to wake the old woman up. She couldn't leave her sitting there, either. She bent the rocker back and slid her arm under Naomi's knees. She worked her other arm around under the old woman's arms and hoisted her out of the chair. She didn't realize Naomi was so frail until she held her in her arms. She didn't weigh more than a child. She carried her mother-in-law to the bedroom and laid her out on the bed. Then she covered her with a quilt. Naomi didn't wake up. Ruth listened to her breathing. If only Ruth could find a way to let her live out the rest of her days without worry, she would have done her duty to her mother-in-law and her dead husband. If only she could let her sit in that rocking chair without shame or want. Naomi sighed in her sleep, and Ruth noticed her head stuck in an awkward position on the pillow. She loosened Naomi's hair from the knot on the back of her head and arranged her head in a more comfortable position. Naomi settled down into sleep again. Was this what it felt like to care for a child? Lots of people said caring for elderly parents and grandparents wasn't much different from raising another child. Now she was finding that out for herself. If there was any truth to it, she would break her back and work her fingers to the bone to care for Naomi. She would provide for her and never let her suffer any want. Ruth let out a long breath and left Naomi to sleep in peace. In the front room, she faced the next challenge of finding a bed for herself. She looked around and found an old couch outside the back door, but mold and damp filled the cushions, and the supports underneath them were broken. Ruth went back inside. Then she remembered the dairy barn. She strolled over to the barn through the thickening twilight. Bird and animal sounds filled the air. They were all preparing to go to sleep, too. Ruth loved this part of the day, when the last of God's beloved creatures said Gute Nacht to each other and to the world. Those sounds would fade into silence, and darkness would fill the world with its soft, sleepy woe. Ruth put her nose into the barn and listened to the cows. In an instant, she determined where they were and how awake they were. She tiptoed in and found the hay crib near the front door. She scooped out an armful of hay and hurried back to the cottage. She dumped the hay in the corner and covered it with a clean sheet from Naomi's room. She stretched out on it and pulled a quilt over herself. In a moment, the dark filled the room and the world outside fell silent. Ruth listened again and recognized Naomi's deep breathing coming from the next room. She closed her eyes with a whispered prayer and let the day slip away. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new experiences. She would start her new life and see where Gott would take her. Chapter 4. Cleaning House. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. Ruth 2:3. Ruth opened her eyes, but the room was still too dark to see anything. The first bird call sounded outside the cottage, and her eyes snapped the rest of the way open. Dawn was coming. She didn't need to know anything else. She jumped up and shook out the quilt. She folded it up and put it back in Naomi's room, along with her sheet. The old woman still slept without a sound. She must be exhausted from her journey. She wouldn't be able to make another trip like that. Ruth scooped up her straw and took it back to the barn. Just enough light filled the yard for her to find her way, and the cows didn't stir when she went inside. She hurried back to the cottage and lit a lamp. She couldn't light the stove until she arranged with Jacob for some wood, but she remembered from last night how dusty and worn everything in the cottage looked. She found a bucket behind the door and filled it from the tap outside. She started scrubbing at the counter in the corner of the front room that served as a kitchen. The cold water burned her hands, but she kept at it until she heard a cow mooing outside. She grabbed her milking pail and headed to the barn. Jacob came out onto his porch at the same moment and caught sight of her walking toward the barn with her pail in her hand. He finished rolling up his sleeves and ran to meet her. "Guter Marie, how was your first night?" Ruth smiled. "Guter Marie, it was wonderful. Thank you." He grinned. "I hope you don't kick too much." Ruth cocked her head to one side. "What do you mean?" "That bed in the cottage must have been a little small for the two of you," he explained. "Oh," she replied, "I didn't sleep in the bed. Naomi did." His head spun around. "Where did you sleep then?" "I made myself a bed in the front room," she told him. There was plenty of bedding. He stared at her. "What did you do? Sleep on the floor?" "Of course not," she replied. "I got an armful of hay from the barn. I slept on that." Jacob couldn't stop staring at her. Then he shook his head and turned away. He muttered something under his breath, but Ruth couldn't make it out. She had to run to catch up to him. "If you don't mind, Jacob, I have a favor to ask you." He whirled around with his lips pressed tightly together. "You don't have to ask. I'll send over another bed for you just as soon as I can find one of the farmhands to carry it in. If I'd known you were going to sleep on a bundle of hay, I would have sent it over last night." Ruth started to say, "You don't have to send over another bed," but he held up his hand to silence her. "Don't you ever do that again," he snapped. "Do you hear me? If you need something, you tell me. You don't go sleeping on a bundle of hay without telling me. Do you understand that?" Ruth pulled her head down between her shoulders. "I understand." He started to turn away, but she hurried to his side. "That's not what I was going to ask." He turned on her again. "No. What was it then?" "I don't mind sleeping on hay," she told him. "I slept very well last night. I slept a lot better than I would have if I had slept in that bed with Naomi." Jacob stared at her. Then he chuckled, and Ruth smiled. "I was going to ask you," she went on, "if I could work for you in the fields, or maybe serve Mary in the house to earn the keep for Naomi and me." He started to turn away again. "You don't have to do that. I'll look after you. You can be certain of that." Ruth jumped in front of him. She couldn't let him walk away without saying her piece. "Please let me do something to earn our living here. You've been more than generous in giving us this cottage and the use of your farm. Let me do something to repay your kindness. I was raised to work hard, and I want to be a blessing here, not a burden. Give me some way to serve the community and my family." Jacob listened with a frown on his face. Then he shook his head again. "You don't have to do anything. You're already doing more than your share by taking care of Naomi. She needs your help a lot more than I do." "I would be taking care of Naomi anyway," Ruth told him. "I'll take care of her as long as she needs me. I just want to do something in exchange for everything you've done for us. I don't feel right about taking all this bounty from you without giving something back." He hitched up his pants around his hips. "If you really want to do something around here, you can clean my brother Boaz's house. He isn't home enough to do it himself, and the place gets neglected. That can be your job, if you really have to have one." Ruth burst into a radiant smile. "Thank you so much, Jacob. May God bless you. I'll do the best job you've ever seen. I won't let you down, I promise." Jacob snorted. "Don't make glowing promises until you've seen the place. He's let it fall into a terrible state being away so much of the time. He never married because his business takes up all his time." The smile evaporated from Ruth's face. "That's a little odd, isn't it? The Amish always marry young, and I've seen men working almost 20 hours a day who still make time to court and marry. He can't be so busy he couldn't get married." Jacob shrugged, and when he started to walk away again, she let him go. "You can ask him about it yourself. I'll introduce you to him as soon as he gets back." Ruth watched him walk away. His brother sounded like a strange character. Amish men do not stay unmarried, no matter how busy they are running businesses. Even a Mennonite girl like Ruth knew that. But she didn't have time to think about that right now. She went to the barn and milked her pail full of milk. Then she cut some vegetables from the garden. Mary showed her the woodshed and insisted she take as much as she needed. Ruth carried an armful of wood back to the cottage and got the fire going. Naomi woke up and immediately installed herself in her rocking chair. Ruth cooked her a hot breakfast, and they both enjoyed the fresh milk. Then Ruth went to work with a song on her lips. The sight of Naomi's contented face gave her all the motivation she needed. With hot, soapy water, she made short work of the tiny house. Pretty soon, the floor and counter shone and the windows sparkled in the sun. Ruth dumped her dirty water outside and rinsed the bucket. Ruth tied on her bonnet. "I'm going out to the fields. You stay here and keep the fire going." "What are you doing out there?" Naomi asked. "The men will be harvesting." "Jacob said I could reap the corners of the field," she replied. "We'll have barley bread and pancakes for supper tonight." Naomi smiled. Then she frowned. "I don't like you working so hard. I should be going with you." Ruth laughed. "Don't you dare. You sit right there and don't move. That's an order. I won't be able to concentrate if I have to wonder what you're doing or if you're all right. Sit tight and let me work. I'll be back in a little while, and then you can keep me company while I make some bread." Naomi smiled again. "All right. Don't work too hard." Ruth laughed again. "That's a good joke." She hurried out of the house before Naomi could argue any more. Chapter 5. Boaz. Then said Boaz unto his servant that was set over the reapers, "Whose damsel is this?" Ruth 2:5. Boaz Beiler stood on his brother's porch and surveyed the farm. Jacob was doing well in his absence. Maybe he should stay away longer next time. Still, the old place tugged at his heartstrings every time he came back home. If only he could settle down to the good plain Amish life the way Jacob did. Boaz sighed and started to turn away when his eye fell on a young Amish woman coming in from the fields. She wore her sunbonnet so he couldn't see much of her face. She carried 2 big buckets on a shoulder yoke across her neck, and they sagged with weight. She held them steady with both hands. The crowd of farmhands followed at her heels, and a couple of them called to her when they parted at the farm gate. One held the gate open so she could keep her load steady with her hands. Boaz heard her voice answer them. But she didn't turn around to face them. She kept her head down and focused on her task. Boaz drew back into the porch shadows. Something about this woman made his heart beat faster, even though she looked like hundreds of other Amish women he'd seen. He couldn't even tell what she looked like under all that black. But her steady gait and concentrated effort stirred something in his soul he had never experienced before. Who was she? He would have walked over to talk to her if he thought it wouldn't spoil the moment. But he knew too many Amish women. You couldn't just mosey up to them and start passing the time of day. She passed through the gate, and her skirts brushed against the fence post. The farmhands went one way, and she went the other. She set her buckets down in front of the old cottage. What was she doing there? She put the yoke aside and stretched her shoulders. Then she untied her bonnet and hung it on a nail. Her white lace bonnet covered her hair underneath, and Boaz saw her face for the first time. She wasn't any special beauty. She was plain as plain could be. But something uncanny shone out of the center of her. It lit up the whole yard, and Boaz almost turned away for shame at having stared at her like that without her knowledge. She would be ashamed if she knew. She put her hand inside the door and came out with a milking pail. She went back across the yard to the dairy barn, and that's where Boaz lost sight of her. He stood perfectly still and waited. He knew how many beats of his own heart it took to milk a cow. He was in no hurry. This was far more important than meeting Jacob to discuss selling the harvest. He could do that any time. Nothing in his life compared to this moment, but he couldn't understand why. What did a plain Amish woman have to do with him? He had his own business to attend to. He had customers to deal with and suppliers to contact. All that took a lot longer for a plain Amish man than it did those Englisher hawkers he met in Lancaster. They could punch a couple of buttons on their cell phones, and the job was done. No wonder Amish young people left on Rumspringa and didn't come back. That life had a lot of advantages. But Boaz never wanted to be anything but Amish. The life spoke to him in a way no Englisher cell phone ever could. He only wished he could enjoy the life instead of always chasing $1 somewhere else. Maybe he would say something to Jacob when he met him later tonight. He would say he was thinking about throwing it all in and coming home. You could knock Jacob over with a feather with that kind of talk. A stir of movement and noise brought his attention back to the barn. 3 farmhands came out, followed by the Amish girl, except she wasn't a girl. She couldn't be. She was wearing black. Only widows wore black like that. His curiosity drove him mad. He almost broke his cover then and there to go up to her. He stopped himself when he noticed one of the farmhands coming toward the porch. Gutter owed Samuel. The hand smiled. Gutter owed Boaz Beiler. You're back again. Boaz nodded. I'm back. Where's Jacob? Samuel nodded toward the barn. With the milking. Boaz nodded toward the woman. Who's the visitor? Samuel's face lit up. She's not a visitor. She's here to stay. She's your kinswoman. Boaz's eyes widened. My kinswoman? I don't have any kinswoman. She's a Mennonite girl, Samuel explained. She showed up with her elderly mother-in-law who was born here. She moved to marry and live New Order in Ohio, and now she's a widow and has come home again. This is her son's widow. Boaz cocked his head on one side. What's she doing here? Your brother Jacob set them to live in the cottage, Samuel explained. He allowed them to help themselves as they had need. Boaz grinned. I see she's helping herself. Samuel's smile disappeared. It isn't that way at all. She would never take anything unless she needed it. She's hard working, and she's modest. She comes out to the barley fields every day and works the corners of the field. You never saw a woman work like her. She always brings in those 2 buckets, heavy laden, and she never says a word to the hands. Although we've all tried to talk to her, she keeps to herself." "What's her name?" Boaz asked. "Jacob calls her Ruth Miller," Samuel replied. Boaz gazed out at the black figure swinging her milking pail back across the yard. "Menished, huh? She looks plain enough to me." "She married an Amish man," Samuel explained. "She lived Amish with her husband's family for 7 years. It's all she knows." "Did Jacob tell you that?" Boaz asked. Samuel dropped his eyes. "I overheard Jacob explaining the situation to Elder Lapp. He had to explain how the 2 women were living in another house on his property, with him a married man, and you, a single Mayan." Boaz nodded. "I understand." "Don't think she's taking advantage," Samuel went on. "She wouldn't do that. She does her share around here. You should see her in the dairy. She milks 4 cows as quick as you like before she fills her own bucket, and that's on top of doing all the work for her old mudder. There's not a hand on the place that doesn't admire her." Boaz rounded on him. "You and the other hands keep your admiration to yourself. You don't bother her, but let her get on with her work. You and the others take good care of her and help her if you can ease her burden." "You don't have to tell us that," Samuel replied. "There's not a man here that wouldn't give anything to help her. But she's that humble, she won't accept help from anyone. She's always plain and decent and civil, but she has to do everything herself." Boaz nodded more to himself than in answer to Samuel's comments. "You do what you can, and if she won't accept help, you let me know. I'll see to her." Samuel went about his business, and Boaz watched Ruth disappear into the cottage with her barley buckets and her milking pail. There was nothing to see anymore, so he went out to the barn to meet his brother. By the time he got there, he'd forgotten all about the woman. When he got back, darkness covered the farm. The houses and barns stuck up black and still against the sky, and the lamplight shining through the farmhouse windows didn't penetrate more than a few feet into the night. Boaz stopped again inside the gate and listened. Voices came out of the open farmhouse door, but nothing else moved. Boaz hesitated to return to his own empty house. He'd avoided the farm for years so he wouldn't have to face that silence. He could stand outside all night and listen to the animals and owls as long as he didn't have to sit alone in his own house. The farmhouse door slammed, and Jacob came out. He stared into the dark. Could he see his brother lurking there? Boaz set off for his house with a determined stride. He pretended not to notice Jacob, and he pulled the screen door open and went inside as if he'd never hesitated to enter it. He stopped dead in his tracks when he walked into a circle of lamplight in his kitchen. He gasped out loud when he saw the woman Ruth on her hands and knees on the floor. She scrubbed the floor with a stiff brush, and the soapy water soaked into her apron. Her head shot up when Boaz entered. Boaz gasped again when he saw her face. She wasn't what he would call a stunning beauty, but her clear eyes and direct gaze arrested all his thoughts in one brief glance. Her eyebrows arched over her pure green eyes in that natural and mesmerizing way that made Amish women so fascinating. What did she see when she looked at him? Did she see the extra weight he carried around his stomach? Did she see the beginnings of wrinkles forming around his eyes? Did she see the scant beard he wore to make himself look just a little more English in the business world? He finally got the words out. "What are you doing here?" Ruth dried her hands on her dirty apron and stood up. "I'm sorry to surprise you like this. Your brother Jacob told me you were coming home today, and I wanted the place to be extra clean for you. I made up your bed, and there's a fresh loaf of bread in the cupboard, but I didn't have time to clean the floor. I was out in the fields all day." "I saw you coming in from the fields," Boaz told her. "That still doesn't explain what you're doing in here scrubbing my floor." "Your brother Jacob told me to keep your house clean and look after the garden to pay my way here," she explained. "I had to do something to repay his kindness to me and my mother-in-law. He wasn't going to make me do anything, but I finally got him to let me do this." Boaz couldn't take his eyes off her. Every word she said enchanted him more. He waved toward the kitchen table. "Sit down. I want to talk to you." Ruth shifted from one foot to the other and looked around the room. "I don't think I should. I should get back to the cottage." "Is your mother-in-law waiting up for you?" Boaz asked. "No, she's asleep," Ruth replied. "She fell asleep in her rocking chair before I came over here. She usually does." "Then you don't have any reason to leave," he pointed out. "Have a seat and relax." Ruth shook her head. "I don't think it's a good idea. It wouldn't be right." "Why?" he asked. "You're a single man and I'm a single woman," she told him. "If we're going to sit here and talk, we should have a chaperone." Boaz snorted. "I'm 36 years old and you're a widow. We're not teenagers. We can sit together and talk without a chaperone." Ruth stayed standing. "Not in your house late at night. We can talk in the morning, although I have to go out to work in the fields again tomorrow." "Why don't we talk on Sundowag? We can sit on Jacob's porch where everyone can see us." Boaz shrugged. "You don't have to sit down, but I'm going to. I'm hungry. I think I'll have some of that bread." He got out the loaf and a wheel of cheese and set them on the table. He took a knife from the drawer. "Do you want some?" Ruth hesitated. She eyed the cheese, and she knew she liked her own bread. "All right. I guess it won't hurt to sit down just for a little while." Chapter 6. A Pure Light. But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before." Ruth 2:11. "I hear you came from Ohio," Boaz remarked. "You had a long journey. Are you happy you made the move?" "It wasn't my choice," she replied. "Naomi decided she wanted to come home, and I came with her. I never really thought about whether I'm happy with it. It doesn't matter. What matters is that Naomi wants to be here. Where she goes, I go. That's the way it works." "Why is that the way it works?" he asked. "Why doesn't it matter whether you're happy, too?" Ruth shrugged. "Service is the highest form of happiness. My job is to take care of Naomi, and she wants to be here." "What about you?" he asked. "Where do you want to be?" "With her," she told him. "Where she belongs, I belong. That's what I'm trying to say. I don't care where I am. I won't be happy unless I'm taking care of her and doing everything in my power to make her happy and secure. She can't take care of herself. I wouldn't be able to rest if I didn't know for certain she was taken care of." Boaz shook his head. "I don't think I've ever met anyone like you before." "I'm sure you've met lots of Amish women who take care of their elderly relatives," Ruth returned. "I can name a dozen women who spend their lives taking care of their mothers and fathers, in-law. You must have met them in your business." "I've met lots of Amish women taking care of their elderly relatives," he agreed, "but none of them are like you." None of them are doing it out of a pure sense of love and service. Every single one of them has a taint of resentment about them. Some of them even have a taint of resentment about taking care of their own children. You don't have that at all." Ruth blushed and lowered her eyes. "I'm no better than they are." Boaz shook his head. "I've never met anyone who doesn't care about their own happiness. They're all carrying a torch for what they want to do and can't do because of the path of service they've taken. Not one of them is truly happy with it the way you are." Ruth cocked her head on one side. "How can you be so sure of that?" "I can see it written all over your face," he told her. "You have a pure light of love shining from inside you, from your heart. I've met a lot of people in my work, and truly I have never met anyone like you before." Ruth looked away. "I'm nothing special." "You are something very special," he replied. "Your price is far above rubies. I always thought that verse was poetic, but I understand it now." Ruth stole a peek at his face. "What about you? Why did you never marry? You're handsome enough to court any woman you wanted." Boaz made a face, but before he could answer, she interrupted him. "I'm sorry. You don't have to answer that. I should mind my own business." "No," he countered. "I want to talk about it." "You don't have to," she insisted. He looked down at his hands in his lap. "I've never talked to anyone about it before. I never met anyone I wanted to talk to about it before, but now that you're here, I want to talk about it." She studied his face. "Jacob says you're too busy with your business." Boaz shrugged. "I let everyone believe that so I wouldn't have to explain the real reason I never married. I heard all the sermons at weddings when I was growing up about God reserving one man and one woman to come together as one flesh. But that made no sense to me. Some of these people getting married had hardly even met each other before they got married. How can a man and a woman come together in Gott if they don't love each other? How can they come together in Gott if they don't even know each other?" Ruth stared at him. "You shouldn't talk like that. That could be blasphemy." "How can it be blasphemy?" he argued. "If I'm going to marry, I want to know for certain I'm marrying the one woman God has set aside for me. The scriptures say a house cannot stand without God. So how can a marriage stand if the man and woman aren't set aside for each other? I wouldn't want to marry the wrong woman and wind up miserable." Ruth shook her head. "I don't think it works that way." "How does it work then?" he asked. "I've been married before," she told him. "You haven't. I barely knew my husband John when we got married, but my father and his father decided beforehand that we should get married, so we did. We weren't miserable. In fact, we were very happy together." "Did you believe he was the man set aside for you by God?" Boaz asked. "There was no way I could tell that before I married him," Ruth replied. "But after 7 years of marriage, I started to believe he was. The only thing missing was children. I started to wonder why God never sent us any children. I started to think maybe he wasn't the man set aside for me, and that was the reason we didn't receive any children. But other than that, I believed he was, right up until he died." "Don't you see?" Boaz asked. "Maybe God took him away so you could find the man who really was set aside for you." Ruth was shocked at such a thought. "I do not think so," Ruth replied, not accepting for a moment that God would take anyone to fulfill someone's selfish desires. "But I do think that our God can take a tragedy and turn it into a blessing, for sure and for certain." "I always wanted to make sure I was marrying the right woman," Boaz explained. "I courted many women when I was younger." "Many?" she asked. Boaz turned red. "Well, a few anyway." How many? She asked. Boaz shifted the knife from one hand to the other. Never mind how many. The important thing is that none of them was the woman set aside for me. How can you be sure? She asked. Maybe one of them was the one set aside for you, and you let your own pride at making your own choice hide her from you. He examined her face. Do you really think that's possible? Do you really think I wouldn't recognize my chosen bride if I met her? Ruth replied, if I submit myself to the situation at hand, I can find God's intended message in it without trying too hard. The man or woman set aside for us is the one we submit ourselves to, not the one we think we want. That's just our own pride demanding its own way. The only way to true happiness and love is through selfless service and obedience to God's will. Boaz smiled at her. You would think that. That's what makes you so much more special and holy than everyone else. I am not special and holy, she insisted. I'm just a Mennonite girl trying to make my way in this world. I'm just trying to do His will and live the life He wants me to live. That's what I mean, he told her. Ruth shifted in her seat. I should go. Boaz's head shot up. What for? You have nowhere to be. Just relax. I have to put Naomi to bed, she replied. She can't sleep in the rocking chair all night. He narrowed his eyes. How do you get her from the chair to the bed? I carry her, Ruth replied. Boaz gasped. You carry her? How could you? She must weigh as much as you do. Ruth shrugged. I've been doing it ever since our first night here. You shouldn't do that, he told her. You could hurt yourself. I won't hurt myself, she replied. Besides, it's my job to make sure she's taken care of. No one else is going to do it. I'll help you, he told her. That way you won't have to do everything yourself. You're already working hard enough. Ruth laughed. I would do it even if you did help me. The smile vanished from his face. I mean it. You've carried this burden alone for long enough. You don't have to carry it alone anymore. Whatever you need, I'll help you. I'll make sure you have what you need so you don't have to go out slaving in the fields all day long. I'll ensure you and Naomi are safe and taken care of. I'll visit my kinswoman Naomi tomorrow with gifts. Ruth shut her eyes and a single tear squeezed out. Thank you. You don't know what your kindness and care mean to me. I know I'm a stranger here and Naomi hasn't lived here for years. I never could have asked any more than the kindness you and Jacob have shown us. I could do nothing else, he replied. Naomi is our kin, and I heard how hard you're working to take care of her. I know God will reward you for your faithfulness and service. Ruth bit her lip to stop herself from crying. Thank you. I should go. You've been so kind to me already. She moved toward the door. Boaz moved to stop her. Before you go, let me give you a blessing. Her eyes widened. Would you? Would you really? He bowed his head. Dear Heavenly Father, I ask you in the name of our precious Lord Jesus Christ to bless this woman for the love and service she's shown to our kinswoman Naomi. Heavenly Father, I ask that you reward her fully and recompense her abundantly for her selfless kindness. Dear Lord, I know she abides under your wing and that she can trust in you for all she needs. Dear Lord, I ask this in the name of our sweet Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. He raised his eyes to find her weeping openly. He barely heard her voice. "Thank you. I'm so comforted by your words. I never expected such kindness toward a stranger, and me a Mennonite woman too. I can never express my gratitude to you and your brother." He stepped back. "Don't thank me. I haven't done anything. Now go home and God go with you. I'll see you tomorrow at your cottage." Chapter 7. The one whom God has chosen. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "You will listen, my daughter. Will you not? Do not go to glean in another field, nor go from here, but stay close." Ruth 2:8. Ruth held the cottage door open, and Boaz stepped down into the farmyard. He turned to smile at Ruth and Naomi. "Thank you so much for honoring us with your visit." Naomi exclaimed, "Your concern and consideration mean the world to two friendless women like us." "You're not friendless anymore," Boaz replied. "I would do anything to ease your burden, and I know my brother Jacob feels the same way. If you need or desire anything in the world, you have but to ask, and it is yours." "We already have more than we could ever need," Naomi told him. "You and Jacob have shown us more generosity than we could ever dream of. You must tell us if there is anything we can do to repay your kindness and hospitality." Boaz put his head on one side. "As a matter of fact, there is one thing you can do for me." "Name it," Naomi returned. "Both Ruth and I are anxious to find a way to return your consideration." "Then come to my house and share a meal with me each day," he replied. "A man gets lonely living alone. My house is cold and empty without people in it, and I would love your company at my table." Ruth dropped her eyes to the ground, but her cheeks and ears glowed bright pink, and she couldn't stop smiling. Naomi blinked back her tears and smiled into Boaz's face. "We would love to come and share a meal with you." Boaz started away. "Excellent. I'll see you tomorrow then." "Gudor Marie." The two women watched him out of sight. "That's a fine man. I'm proud to call him my nephew." Ruth didn't answer. She went back into the cottage and changed into a different dress and apron. Naomi's eyes widened when she saw her. "You're not going out to the barley fields today, are you?" "You can't after the gift Boaz made us of 2 50-pound sacks of flour. We won't need barley for the rest of the season." "I'm not going out to the barley fields," Ruth replied. "But we still need milk. I still have to go to the dairy shed." She grabbed her pail and swept across the yard. In the distance, the farmhands dotted the horizon on their way to their work. She closed her eyes to the sunshine and took a deep breath. The memory of Boaz at their table in the cottage and the anticipation of seeing him again in his own house filled her with profound contentment. What could be wrong in the world now? She stepped into the cold shadow of the barn and set to work milking. She hummed to herself and rested her cheek against the cow's flank for warmth. The peaceful silence, interrupted only by the cows munching, soothed her soul and took her cares away. On her way back to the cottage with her pail, she caught herself glancing toward Boaz's house. Would she see him again? Was he watching for her too? Her heart fluttered when she thought of him, and she cast her eyes back down to the ground. She should be ashamed of herself for even thinking about him that way. He hadn't asked to court her, had he? He wasn't thinking anything about her except that she was his kinswoman. She wasn't even that. Naomi was his kinswoman, not her. She wasn't even Naomi's daughter-in-law. In-law anymore now that John was dead. She was just a stranger who happened along. Still, she couldn't stop herself from grabbing her bowl and heading to the garden after she dropped off her milk. Maybe, just maybe, he would see her outside and come out to talk to her. She shouldn't think that way, but she couldn't help it. She cut a few stalks of celery and pulled an onion. The lettuce had turned too bitter with the changing of the season, but the tomatoes were still good. They fell into her hand at the slightest touch with that warm, sweet smell of summer's end. She started back toward the cottage. She didn't have any more reason to stay outside, and if she tarried, Naomi would start to wonder what she was doing out there. She paused with her hand on the gate and cast one last glance toward Boaz's house. There was still no sign of him. She sighed. All of a sudden, a voice greeted her from behind. Gooder owed Ruth Miller. She whirled around and found herself face to face with Samuel. Gooder owed Samuel. What are you doing in from the field so early? Jacob let us go, he replied. The thresher broke its axle. Jacob and Boaz are out there fixing it, so they let the rest of us go home. They won't need us until they get it fixed, and that won't be until tomorrow morning. I don't expect they'll be in before sunset. Ruth's heart sank. So that's why he didn't come out to talk to her. He wasn't even in his house. She started to turn away, but he stopped her. Are you courting anybody, Ruth Miller? He asked. Ruth's eyes popped open. Me? Of course not. I wouldn't court anybody, not now. Oh, he asked. Why not? Because, she stammered. Naomi needs me, and I'm only just a widow. I don't think I'll be courting anybody for a long time. I might never court anybody again. Samuel frowned. You can't do that. You're still young. You've got your whole life ahead of you, and Naomi won't need you forever. You've been a widow. 5 months, she replied. 5 months, he repeated. There you go. That's plenty of time. You could court anybody you wanted now. Ruth shook her head, but her face turned bright red. She couldn't look him in the eye. Don't go hiding behind Naomi, he replied. You deserve to marry and have a family and a future. I'm sure Naomi understands that as well as anybody. She understands, Ruth replied. It's me that doesn't want to court anybody. Samuel cocked his head. You don't want to court anybody, ever. That's not normal. She shrugged. Maybe not. But that's the way I feel. He called after her. Hey, Ruth. She turned around, and this time she looked up into his face. What is it? In that instant, she stared right into his heart and saw the intention written there. She couldn't have misunderstood him if he'd painted a sign on the side of the barn. So why didn't his attention shame and confuse and frighten her? Why did she smile at him and let his eyes play on her? Would you let me walk you to church on Swandiag? He asked. She laughed out loud. Why did she do that? Why didn't she shut him down with a cold, hard rejection? I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think Naomi will go to church, and I'd better stay with her. You could ask her, Samuel suggested. I'm sure she would be happy for you to go. Ruth turned away. I don't think so. I'm not ready to court anybody yet. He moved to her side as she hurried through the gate. Is there someone else? Is there someone other than me you would rather court? There is no one else. But she didn't look him in the eye when she said it. She couldn't. Would you tell me if there was? He asked. Would you tell me straight out you were interested in someone else? She stopped and faced him. There is no one else. Samuel. Okay. He walked along at her side to keep up with her. Maybe later then. She shook her head, but she didn't stop walking. I don't think so. I'm giving all my time and attention to Naomi right now. I won't be courting anybody for a while. She got to her porch and hurried inside without another word. Samuel called up after her through the slamming screen door, "I'll see you later, Ruth." But she didn't answer. She listened to his footsteps fading down the driveway before she came back out to the porch to get her milk. At least she wouldn't see him again today. Why did the attentions of that man make her so uncomfortable? She hadn't experienced this kind of anxiety since before she married John. She hadn't experienced it even then, since she never really courted anybody, not even him. Her father introduced her to John and said he was a man she might like to marry. She deferred to his judgment, and the next thing she knew, she was married. She never went through the whole "does he like me" phase of courtship. She never had to think about whether a man liked her and wanted to marry her. She thanked heaven she'd managed to skip all that when she married John. Now here she was, a widow, and experiencing all the hesitant excitement of a teenager on her first courtship. In fact, this was her first courtship, and she wasn't even courting. But it wasn't just the attentions of a man that made her nervous. It was the attentions of that man. Why? She didn't have to ask herself that question. She wouldn't have minded the attentions of a man if he was the right man, and Samuel just wasn't the man she wanted paying her so much attention. So why hadn't she just told him to his face that she wasn't interested? What was wrong with her? She never shied away from telling anyone what she thought before. Why did she do it now? She paused on her porch with a milking pail in her hand. She noticed the cream settling on the top. She better get inside before it spoiled, but she indulged in one last look toward Boaz's house. He wouldn't be there again before she went to sleep. She could go over there and give the place a quick clean and be back home before he came in from fixing the thresher. But she wouldn't do that. She would wait until he was around home. If she really didn't want the attentions of a man, she would clean his house while he was gone. Instead, she wanted to wait until he was around in the hope of catching him. She wanted an excuse to go over there and talk to him. If he wasn't there, she didn't want to go. Ruth felt guilty for telling Samuel a falsehood. She wanted to court somebody, and she knew who she wanted to court. But it wasn't him. Chapter 8. Samuel. So she kept close to the maidens of Boaz to glean until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, and lived with her mother-in-law. Ruth 2:23. Ruth waited until the hands went out to the field the next morning before she went to the dairy barn to milk. She disliked tiptoeing around, but the thought of running into Samuel gave her heart palpitations. She found the place as empty as the day before and settled into the quiet rhythm of milking. All at once, a voice startled her out of her reverie. "You're late to your milking today." She glanced over her shoulder and found Samuel leaning on the hay crib. She turned her back on him. "Gooder Mary, Samuel, why aren't you at work with the others?" "I just got here," he told her. "I had to help my father with a sick ewe, and I saw you come in here, so I came in here too." Ruth finished milking and stood up. "I'm sure the other hands will be waiting for you. Jacob must be wondering where you are." "I sent him word by my nephew that I would be late," Samuel explained. "He won't mind if I'm a few more minutes late." Ruth straightened her apron. "Can I do anything for you?" "I thought you might need help carrying your milk home," Samuel suggested. "I never needed help before," she told him. "I don't need help now." "Let me help you," he exclaimed. "You shouldn't have to do everything yourself all the time." Ruth hesitated. What could be wrong with letting him carry her milk for her? She wasn't exactly agreeing to let him court her. All right, you can carry it. He pushed himself off the crib, but he didn't jump forward to pick up the pail. He looked at her face instead. You've worked hard since you came here. I'm sure your old mother appreciates it. Ruth shrugged and looked away. Are you carrying my milk or not? He smiled and picked up the pail. She fell in at his side on the way out of the barn, but he didn't walk as fast as she wished he would. Is anyone walking you to church on Suundawa? Yes, she replied. Naomi. Samuel chuckled. So she is going after all. Would you mind if I walked you both to church? Ruth didn't look up. She knew this was coming. Maybe another time. When? He asked. Why don't you ask Naomi about that? She suggested. I'm asking you, he replied. Can't you make a decision for yourself? She shrugged. It doesn't matter. You've been a widow for 5 months, he pointed out. You don't have any reason to hold back. You wouldn't understand, she murmured. They stepped out into the clear light of day, and Samuel stumbled and almost spilled the milk when they ran into Boaz at the gate. His eyes widened when he saw them together. Ruth's heart soared, and she smiled at him. Maybe he could find a way to get Samuel away from her. Guter Marie. He smiled back at her, but he frowned at Samuel with the milk pail in his hand. Are you going out to the fields? Samuel didn't bat an eyelash. I'm just on my way there now. Boaz arched his eyebrow, but he didn't answer. Why didn't he say something? He could send Samuel packing with a single word, but he only turned away. Samuel went on to the cottage and set the pail by the door. He nodded to Ruth as he passed through the gate. Let me know if you want someone to walk you to church. Boaz's head spun around. Then his shoulders sagged and he kept walking toward his house. Ruth could have kicked herself and Samuel too. She tried to catch Boaz's eye. Boaz, He was already through the gate and left Ruth standing alone. She went back to the cottage, but she couldn't get him out of her mind. All day, her mind turned on every scheme she could think of to be where he was. The problem was, he didn't keep any special schedule. She had to watch for him from her door and hope to catch him when he went into and out of his house. Now he'd seen Samuel carrying her milk and offering to walk her to church. He would assume she wanted Samuel to court her. He couldn't think anything else. Then again, what would be so bad about walking to church with Samuel? A part of her female heart rejoiced to be courting someone again. She ought to be flattered. He wanted her. He'd shown more interest in her than Boaz. She never realized she hated being alone until after John died. Maybe that's why she wanted to stay with Naomi. Whatever happened to them, at least she wouldn't face it alone. She would love to court and get married again. Her life would have purpose again, and she could look forward to the future with hope and joy. What could Naomi offer her but years of shared widowhood? Did she really want that? Of course not. But she didn't feel that hope and joy with Samuel. She hadn't felt it until Boaz showed up. So why did he have to let her down by turning away? He could have stood up to Samuel and claimed her for his own then and there. Instead, he caved to the younger man and let Samuel carry her milk for her. In the end, she had to put the whole matter out of her head. She had work to do, and she would drive herself crazy thinking like this. She fell to her work and enjoyed baking up her bread with the pure white flour Boaz had given her. He was such a kind and considerate man. He looked straight into her heart and saw what she needed. Samuel didn't even try to do that. She turned her finished loaves out onto the board and took her bowl to the garden. A bell rang over the hill, and she worked just a little faster. The hands would be coming in from the field soon. Maybe she would see Boaz again. She filled her bowl and headed for the cottage. She burst into a radiant smile when she spotted Boaz coming through the gate. Guter owed Boaz Beiler. He smiled back at her, and he couldn't disguise his delight at seeing her. Alone this time. Guter owed Ruth Miller. This was her big chance to get him to open up and show he felt the same way about her. Did you get the thresher fixed? Boaz's eyes widened. How did you know about that? Ruth dropped her eyes. Samuel told me. Boaz frowned. Oh. Boaz, she began, about this morning. He shook his head. You don't have to explain. I understand. You don't owe me any explanation. Ruth's heart beat faster. She couldn't let him slip through her fingers. That's not what I was going to say. I only meant, I'm sure you've been waiting long enough to court somebody, he told her. You deserve a husband as much as any other woman, and you're young. You have your whole life ahead of you. Samuel is a perfect choice for you. Ruth shook her head in exasperation. That's not what I was going to say. Just let me finish, Boaz. I only meant... Boaz's head shot up. Here he comes. I'll leave you two alone together. Ruth looked around in wild desperation. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of Samuel striding across the field toward them. Boaz. He shook her head. I understand. He started to move away. Ruth could only watch him in despair. How could she ever explain? Chapter 9. Proposal. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, My daughter, shall I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Ruth 3:1. Ruth was pulling the clean milking pail out from under the counter in the cottage again when Naomi called to her from her rocking chair. Are you going to milk again? I thought I'd make some buttermilk, Ruth told her. I have enough cream for butter, and I know you like buttermilk in your bread. I need extra milk for that. You don't have to milk so much, Naomi told her. We have enough. I thought you might like it, Ruth replied. You're spending an awful lot of time in the barn, Naomi remarked. You're not going there to meet Samuel, are you? Ruth gasped. Of course not. What makes you ask that? Naomi shook her head. I've seen you two together. He finds any excuse to help you and work alongside you. He always manages to be in the dairy barn when you go there to milk. He would probably bring you the milk right here to this very cottage door if you asked him to. Ruth lowered her head. I'm sure he would. Are you still milking 4 cows before you draw your own milk? Naomi asked. Ruth nodded. Always. Gut! Naomi exclaimed. Anything you can do to contribute to this farm will go a long way to repay Jacob and Boaz for their generosity. That's why I do it, Ruth replied. All right then, Naomi agreed. Off you go. I'll see you when you get back. Ruth took her milking pail and crossed the yard to the dairy shed. She didn't see Samuel anywhere. Maybe he'd gone back out to the fields. She stepped into the barn with a light heart, but she stopped on the threshold when she almost collided with him next to the hay crib. What are you doing here? He stepped closer to her. I came to see you. Ruth dropped her eyes and tried to step around him. You should be out in the barley fields with the others. I told Jacob I forgot my sharpening stone, he told her. I told him I would come back to get it, but I really came to see you." "You shouldn't have told a falsehood," Ruth scolded. "You'll bear the guilt of that and pay the penalty." He moved to her side and followed her to the cattle tie-ups. "I would pay any price to be near you, Ruth. Let me court you. You won't regret it." "I don't think so," Ruth mumbled. "Give me a chance," Samuel insisted. "I'm in line to inherit my father's farm. In a few years, I'll be as rich and successful as Jacob and Boaz. You could share all that instead of scraping for crumbs around here. What do you say? We're the same age, and I'm one of the most eligible matches in this community." "Then you shouldn't have any trouble finding another woman to court," Ruth pointed out. "I'm happy to scrape for crumbs around here. You go find yourself an eligible young woman, and may God bless you." "I don't want some other eligible young woman," he replied. "I want you. I've had my eye on you since you first came here. I won't be satisfied until you agree to let me court you." Ruth knelt down next to one of the cows. "Then I guess you won't be satisfied." Samuel knelt down next to her and took hold of her milking pail. "Let me do that for you." Ruth pulled the bucket away. "Don't you know it's a sin to covet your neighbor's wife?" "You're nobody's wife, Ruth," Samuel replied. "You're a widow." "I just told you I didn't want you to court me," she told him. "That means I don't want to be your wife. I want to be someone else's wife. So put me out of your head. Otherwise, you're coveting a woman who doesn't belong to you, and that's a mortal sin." Samuel drew back and regarded her. Ruth bent to her milking, and Samuel's desire cooled. "All right, Ruth. I won't bother you anymore," she muttered back under her breath. He stood over her until she finished her milking. She ignored him as best she could, but when she stood up, she found him smiling at her with a different expression on his face. He'd given up. He could be a friend to her now, without expecting anything in return. "At least let me carry your milk home for you. I'm on my way out to the barley fields anyway." Ruth smiled back at him. "All right. But promise me you won't tell Jacob any more falsehoods. I don't want you to endanger your soul." "I won't," he told her. "I won't have any reason to sneak back here to talk to you." He picked up the pail, and they walked together to the cottage. He set the pail down outside her door. "I'm sorry about the misunderstanding. I thought I was making progress by helping you and working with you. I guess my head got too big for my boots." "Anyone could have made that mistake," Ruth replied. "I only wish you had helped me out of kindness and not to try to get something from me." He hung his head and nodded. "You're right. You're always right." "Not always," she replied. "Now get back to work. Jacob won't like you being slothful when he's paying your wages." Samuel strode away to the barley fields. Ruth was just about to take the milk inside when she caught sight of Boaz on his porch. He must have seen Samuel and Ruth come out of the dairy barn together. He must have seen Samuel carrying her bucket for her, and he must have seen her smiling into his face. Her cheeks burned for shame. What must he think? He could only think one thing. She tried to catch his eye and wave to him, but he went back inside without a sign of recognition to her. Her heart sank, and she nearly tore the screen door off its hinges, trying to get into the cottage. Naomi jumped in her rocking chair. "What's the matter with you?" Ruth wrung her hands and paced back and forth. "I'm ruined. I thought I had a chance at happiness, but I ruined it. I'll never be anything but a widow, and I have no one to blame for it but myself." "What are you talking about?" Naomi asked. "I'm talking about Boaz," Ruth blurted out. "I thought I had a chance with him. but I made a terrible mistake, and now he won't even look at me sideways. Samuel's been finding ways to get close to me for days. He just told Jacob a falsehood about fetching his sharpening stone so he could meet me in the dairy barn." "What did you do?" Naomi asked. "The question is, what did he do?" Ruth replied. "He asked to court me. He said he was one of the most eligible men in the community, and I would inherit his father's farm with him when the old man died." "What's Samuel's family name?" Naomi asked. "King," Ruth replied. "If it's the King family, I think it is," Naomi went on. "He's telling the truth. They have a huge farm, and he's the only son." "I don't care about that," Ruth replied. "I'm not marrying him." "Why not?" Naomi asked. "Because I want to marry Boaz," Ruth replied. "That's why." Naomi gave a surprised cry. "You do, but you never showed any sign before." "I know," Ruth replied. "I've kept my feelings secret from everyone, even you." "There's no way I could ever marry Boaz." "Why not?" Naomi asked. "He's handsome enough and rich enough. He's a lot richer than Samuel King will ever be." "You're not worried about him being older than you, are you?" "He's not that much older than me," Ruth pointed out. "He's 36 and I'm 26. That's 10 years. That's nothing in the Amish world." "Then why do you think you don't have a chance with him?" Naomi asked. "He's been our most loyal friend and ally." "That's exactly the problem," Ruth told her. "He's our friend, but he doesn't feel the same way about me. His heart is closed to me. He told me once he's courted women before, but none of them was the woman set aside for him by Gott. He must feel the same way about me because he's never given me any indication of being anything other than my closest friend and ally. I've been waiting for days, but he never shows any sign of feeling anything deeper." "Then maybe you should let him go," Naomi suggested. "If his heart is closed to you and he never gives any sign of feeling anything more for you, give your heart to someone else. You could marry Samuel after all." "I couldn't," Ruth replied. "I'm convinced Boaz is the man set aside for me by Gott. I can't get him out of my mind. I never felt this way about any man before, not even John." Ruth stopped in the middle of the floor. Then she threw herself at Naomi's feet. "I'm so sorry, Mommy. I shouldn't have said that." Naomi laid her hand on Ruth's shoulder. "You don't have to apologize. I know you didn't feel that way about John when you married him. It wasn't that kind of marriage, was it? Your father and Eli arranged it, and a mother couldn't have asked for a more dutiful and loving wife for her son. You gave John 7 wonderful years. Now it's your turn to be happy." "I can never be happy with Samuel King," Ruth insisted. "Please don't ask me to marry him." Naomi smiled down at her. "I won't ask you to do that. But you must realize that Boaz could be hiding the same feelings for you. He could be wishing he could court you." "Then why doesn't he come forward?" Ruth asked. "Why doesn't he ask to court me?" "Maybe he's embarrassed," Naomi suggested. "Or maybe he's just scared you'll turn him down. You say he saw you with Samuel. Maybe he thinks you want to court Samuel, and he doesn't want to spoil your chances with a younger man. He is Samuel's employer, after all." "But what am I going to do?" Ruth cried. "I've waited and waited, but he won't say anything. I can't just walk up to Boaz and tell him I want to marry him. I'm at my wit's end." "You can't just wait and hope for him to come forward on his own," Naomi told her. "You have to think of your own future. If you won't marry Samuel and you have your heart set on Boaz, you have to make the first move." "I couldn't do that," Ruth insisted. "It wouldn't be modest." "You have to," Naomi told her. "You could grow old waiting for him. Maybe you should ask him if he would consider taking you for a buggy ride." Ruth gasped out loud. "Mommy, I could never do that." Naomi shook her head. Her eyes gazed somewhere into space over Ruth's head at something beyond mortal sight. "You have to. Just in the few minutes we've been sitting here talking, I'm convinced Boaz is the right man for you. He's my kinsman. He's single. He's successful, and he cares for you." "Are you sure?" Ruth asked. Naomi chuckled to herself. "I might be old, but I'm not completely blind. Not yet, anyway. I've seen the way he looks at you, and I've seen the way you look at him. He's shy, that's all, but his feelings for you are real. They're a lot more real than Samuel's." "That's for certain." "So what am I supposed to do?" Ruth asked. "I just told you," Naomi replied. "Ask him if he would consider taking you for a buggy ride. I'm your mother, and this is for your own good. I have your future to think of." Ruth hesitated. Then her chin sank down on her chest. "All right, Mommy." Chapter 10. More Than a Buggy Ride. Then he said, "Blessed are you of the Lord, my daughter, for you have shown more kindness at the end than at the beginning, in that you did not go after young men, whether poor or rich." Ruth 3:10. Ruth spotted Boaz standing on his porch. She looked around the yard. Jacob and the farmhands were out in the fields. On the other side of the yard, Mary finished hanging out her laundry and took her basket into her own house. A few chickens pecked at the grass, but besides them, nothing else moved in the farmyard. She would never find a better time to go talk to him. It was now or never. She never would have approached a man like this if Naomi hadn't ordered her to. No plain Amish woman would be so forward. But Naomi must know something she didn't if she told Ruth to do something so unconventional. She's seen enough of relationships with men and women in her years. Ruth submitted to her authority in this, as in everything else. She put down her bucket, took a deep breath, and strode across the yard. Boaz pretended not to notice her until she got to the bottom of his steps. Then he looked up and smiled. "Gooder Mari, Ruth Miller." She couldn't help but smile back at him. Her heart thundered in her chest. She only hoped she wasn't blushing too badly. "Gooder Marie, Boaz Beiler." "I trust you're well." The color spread over his cheeks. "I'm well, as I hope you are." "Oh, I'm well," she replied. Ruth shifted from one foot to the other and watched the chickens scratching next to the barnyard fence. Boaz gazed across the fields. Why didn't he say something? But she was the one who was supposed to be talking to him. "You said I should tell you if I needed anything," she blurted out. Boaz's eyes widened. "Of course. You can ask me for anything." He waved his hand. "Why don't you sit down while we talk? We're out in plain view, so you don't have to worry about being alone with me." Ruth blushed again. "I'm sorry I said that. I should have known you would be perfectly plain." Boaz straightened a chair. "Here, have a seat." Ruth mounted to the porch, but she shook her head at the chair. "Thank you, but I think I'd rather stand." His head spun around. "All right, as you please. Now what can I do for you?" "I wouldn't ask myself," she told him, "but Naomi insisted I ask you." "Of course," he repeated. "You know I'll do anything for you and Naomi. You have only to ask. You've never asked me for anything." I'm glad for any opportunity to serve you." Ruth kicked at an invisible speck of dust at her feet. "You won't be serving me, but that's by the by." Boaz shut his mouth. "You know what I mean." Ruth fidgeted in the silence. She gulped and wrung her hands until her knuckles ached. How could she bring herself to ask for his attention? She would never be able to live with the shame if he turned her down. She would have to leave the farm. She would have to leave the whole community if anyone found out what she'd done. Boaz coughed. "So what can I do for you?" Her eyes flew to his face. Would he ever understand? Would he ever forgive her for her inexcusable rudeness? Could she dare to hope he might accept her proposal? She took another deep breath and tightened her fists. "I was wondering, if you're not too busy, you know." "I'm never too busy for you, Ruth," he replied. Ruth waved her hand. She couldn't look at him anymore. She couldn't raise her eyes from the toes of her shoes. She mumbled under her breath. At least that way she could pretend she hadn't actually said the words out loud. "I was wondering if you might be willing to take me for a buggy ride." Boaz's astonished cry brought her head up so fast she almost strained her neck. "Ruth!" She almost burst into tears. "I didn't want to ask, but Naomi told me I had to. Please just pretend I never asked, and we can go back to the way things were before." He seized her hand and his eyes misted over. "Nothing will ever go back to the way it was before. Not in 1,000,000 years. You don't know how happy you've made me. I've been racking my brain to come up with a way to ask you to let me court you, but I thought you would never want me. I thought I'd better leave you to Samuel and the other young men. "Why wouldn't I want you?" she asked. "Well," he replied, "I'm almost 10 years older than you, and you're so young and beautiful." Ruth tried to pull her hand out of his, but he held on tight. "I'm nothing to look at." He shook his head. His eyes bored into her soul. "You're the most beautiful woman in the world, and not just on the outside. I can see the clear light of heaven coming through your heart and out through your eyes and your face. Everybody can see it. That's why you have so many admirers here already." Ruth's eyes popped open. "I don't have admirers. Samuel has asked to court me, but that's all." Boaz shook his head again. "They're probably all holding their feelings inside the way I was. They probably all think they aren't good enough for you, the way I did, the way I do." "You are more than good enough for me," she told him. "I'm the one who's not good enough for you." He moved closer to her, and she studied the fine grain of his skin. "Ruth Miller, would you please give me the honor of going for a boogie ride with me?" Ruth burst out laughing through her tears. "I would be honored to go for a buggy ride with you." Boaz whooped to the rafters for joy, and he couldn't stop himself from sweeping her up into his arms. "Forget the boogie ride. Marry me, Ruth. Say you'll marry me." She laughed in his arms, and when he set her on her feet again, she smiled up into his eyes. "I think you better talk to Naomi about that." Chapter 11. Abundantly Above. So Boaz took Ruth, and she was his wife. Ruth 4:13. 1 year later, Naomi sat in her rocking chair. The big enameled stove in Boaz's kitchen kept the house much warmer than the little iron box stove in the cottage. She sat by the stove all day long now, and Boaz carried her to her room when she fell asleep there at night. Naomi rocked and rocked. She kept a firm hold on her own excitement and rocked faster to stop herself from fretting too much. She would hear the moment there was any news. Her eyes skimmed over the shelves of shining cups and sparkling glassware. Naomi had never lived with such luxury in her life. Ruth had made a much better marriage with Boaz than she ever did with John Miller. Her decision to travel back to Iowa with Naomi seemed strange and foolhardy at the time, but it turned out to be the smartest thing she could have done. Naomi closed her eyes, but she couldn't fall asleep now for the world. She hadn't slept in over 24 hours, but excitement kept her awake. She would sleep when it was all over. The sound of a door opening made her turn around in her chair, and the midwife came into the kitchen. The woman took Naomi's hand. "You can come in now." Naomi burst into a radiant smile. "Finally, I thought the baby would never come." The midwife laughed and raised the old woman from her chair. All in God's good time. She led Naomi into the big master bedroom, where they found Ruth propped up against a mountain of pillows. She held a bundle wrapped in white in her arms, and Boaz stood, proudly looking on next to the window. They both gazed down at their newborn son with pure bliss written on their faces. Naomi stopped in the doorway and stared at the two of them. Ruth looked up at her and smiled. "There you are, Mommy. Come in and say hello to your grandboblin, Obed." Naomi burst into tears. She covered her mouth with her hand, but she couldn't hold back her sobs. "I never thought this day would come." The midwife conducted her to a chair next to Ruth's bed. Then she took the baby from Ruth's arms and placed him in Naomi's waiting embrace. Naomi gazed through her tears at the crumpled little face. "How does it feel to be a Mommy?" Ruth asked. "Thank God for this day," Naomi whispered. "May God be praised, who has seen me through all my trouble and given me such a fine son in place of the ones I lost. All things come back to God, and none can fathom His mercy." The end. Thank you for listening. Here at PureRead, we aim to serve you, our dear readers and listeners, with good, clean Christian stories. You can be assured that any PureRead book you pick up will not only be hugely enjoyable, but free of any objectionable content. We are deeply thankful to you for choosing our books. Your support means that we can continue to provide stories like the one you have just listened to. To browse our range of clean and wholesome titles, go to pureread.com. Please like and subscribe to our channel. That way you'll be the first to hear when new stories arrive here for your enjoyment. God bless you, and thank you again for listening.